yet now we have an entire economic system built upon the principle of covetousness. The big question is, how is that really going to work out for us? Well, if we look at the way things are trending, any sane person would think this is not going to work out very well. I can remember one time I was invited to address a very large group of church leaders in the Philippines within the Catholic Church, and they had been asking me to speak on the topic of reverence or respect for life and family. And I did raise this topic and spoke to them about it. I mean, within Catholicism, people were taught that if you transgress, you break one of these great commandments, you will be eternally condemned unless one seeks redemption. And the fact that we have a whole economic system and everybody being utterly driven by and involved in transgressing one of these points seems to have just escaped everybody's attention. You don't see the bishops, you don't see the priests, you don't see people standing up and actually talking about it in a very direct manner. And I find that quite astonishing, that people have just like, whew, that one has just flown by. So the problem is that when a person adopts this impetus of greed and envy, you will always end up with tremendous conflict. There will be, just like in that Gordon Gekko movie Wall Street from earlier, with him tearing apart businesses, corporations, and workers, being laid off and suffering because of that. When you adopt this greed and envy as being the big driving forces, then it will always end up with conflict. There will be huge conflict between man and the very world that he lives on and depends upon. There will be conflicts between people. You get corporations or large businesses simply looking upon you and I and everybody else as consumers to exploit. We look upon each other as exploitable objects. And we have a big internal conflict and our own lack of fulfillment. But one of the things that really stuck in my mind when I was young, I can remember hearing my dad talking about something that he had heard or read, where there was some big advertising guy that had been stating that cigarettes were the perfect product to sell. There is no better product to sell. And he had rattled off 3 reasons. One is it's very cheap. Second, it is easily consumed. And third, it is highly addictive. And that was considered like almost humorous back in the late 50s, early 60s. That was a hilarious idea. That was just like, now of course people have grown to understand that the physical addiction that one can have to nicotine and the consequences of smoking in terms of effects on people's health, and then the ramifications on people's families and all those kind of things are clearly representative of what happens when we have a society and an economic system where greed and envy are the key driving forces. If Schumacher's response to that earlier statement of Keynes about greed and envy being acceptable drives for economic growth, was as follows. I should think that there is now enough evidence to demonstrate that the statement is false in a very direct, practical sense. If human vices, such as greed and envy, are systematically cultivated, the inevitable result is nothing less than a collapse of intelligence. A man driven by greed or envy loses the power of seeing things as they really are, of seeing things in their roundness and wholeness. And his very success becomes his failure. That is such a profound observation. And I think that it would do us well to perhaps go back and look at that, and occasionally look at that again. And I'll post it in the blog so you can also read it and reflect upon it, because the consequence that he points out of being driven by greed and envy is nothing less than a collapse of intelligence. And we see this collapse of intelligence when people become prepared to engage in so-called economic activity without real regard for the consequences that the products or services or ideas that they are selling, the consequences that they will have on others. I mean, we see it, just look at the whole, and again we'll be doing another video on that, on the whole smartphone phenomena and the tremendous detrimental effect that it's having on people. And the fact that there was a recent confession by one of the founders of, can't recall whether, I think it was Apple, yeah, one of the founders of Apple, where he said they knew from the beginning that all people, there were things that people would become addicted to. And they would try to use devices and develop techniques and methods to make it so that people spent more and more time on these devices. The fact that it would have a very detrimental effect on individuals' lives was irrelevant. The fact that people become less social from using social media is sort of like irrelevant. They want your attention, as much attention, for as long as possible, because they exploit that economically. You simply become someone or something to exploit for economic benefit. So Schumacher continues, if whole societies become infected by these vices, meaning greed and envy, they may indeed achieve astonishing things, but they become increasingly incapable of solving the most elementary problems of everyday existence. The gross national product may rise rapidly, as measured by statisticians, but not as experienced by actual people who find themselves oppressed by increasing frustration, alienation, insecurity, and so forth. So, once again, I will encourage you to look at that one and reflect upon it in relation to your life and the news that you may consume on a daily basis or weekly basis, and you will see a growing relevance of what has been stated here. After a while, even the gross national product refuses to rise any further, not because of scientific or technological failure, but because of a creeping paralysis of non-cooperation, as expressed in various types of escapism on the part not only of the oppressed and exploited, but even of the highly privileged groups. So that's quite an amazing insight that he is offering here. And again, this was back in the very early 70s. He already had this perception. And it is becoming increasingly obvious that as these large cities and metropolises grow and expand, as people become more caught up in simply chasing the money, looking for ways to get ahead and have more experiences that are meant to make them happy, people become increasingly isolated and withdrawn, alienated, and the need to then escape from my daily life becomes more and more pressing. And we see this manifest in a number of ways. One of them is the use of stimulants and mind-altering substances, whether it's alcohol, illegal drugs, prescription drugs, just endlessly the way people become lost in pornography and spend hours and hours just looking at fundamentally the same thing over and over again. This escapism, he predicts, is going to become a greater and more influential part of our life and have a profound effect on everyone. Modern economy is entirely dependent upon the expansion of needs and the attempt to satisfy unlimited desire. And this is the antithesis of wisdom and must always result in conflict. But we will be examining that, what exactly constitutes wisdom in another video. The nature of these conflicts, as I had spoken about just earlier or touched on, you will see a conflict of man against nature. We have become so separated from the environment in which we live, we are unable to actually comprehend the fact that this earth is almost like, and we could almost, although it's not, we can refer to it as almost like a living organism. There are so many closed systems, and we are dependent upon so many of these things happening just for our physical health. When man becomes overly avaricious, when he is so driven by money and greed, then we become prepared to have the most horrible and catastrophic effects on the environment, and we don't even really want to recognize that it's happening. And even if I recognize that it's happening, I become unwilling to alter my behavior, the things I buy, the way in which I live, that which I consume. I don't want to look at that or do anything very much about it. And then you see the conflict of man with others, all the way from, the most horrible end, the great wars and all this tremendous violence, and you can see it even within, one of the most sad things about social media has been that people feel so insulated that they can easily attack and victimize others, drive other people to even suicide through cruel and harmful things, things that they would never do to somebody's face. This is all of these things are a product of having made these very bad choices that are leading us down this very horrible rabbit hole. And of course, the third area of conflict is conflict within oneself, where I am buying into so many false ideas. I am being sold so many ideas, and when I accept them, and then I don't experience the fulfillment and the happiness that's been promised, I feel rather distressed. I can experience depression. I can become even suicidal. One of the things that we miss within this type of society that we're building is a complete lack of peacefulness. You know, we barely know what that means, and we rarely experience it within our life. A great and famous spiritual teaching is that without peace, there cannot be happiness. E.F. Schumacher went on to state that I suggest that the foundations of peace cannot be laid by universal prosperity in the modern sense, because such prosperity, if attainable at all, is attainable only by cultivating such drives of human nature as greed and envy, which destroy intelligence, happiness, serenity, and thereby the peacefulness of man. Any unhappiness or emptiness we feel is always within. It's not outside of us, it's within. And yet we seek to assuage these feelings of emptiness or unhappiness by searching outside of ourselves. There is a very ancient spiritual truth. This truth is that we should aspire to be self-satisfied, meaning I can be anywhere, I can be in any situation, and regardless of what's going on around me, I can feel a peacefulness and satisfaction within. This condition was referred to in the ancient Sanskrit language as an Atmarama, one who is experiencing joy or happiness within. If we are to progress as individuals to a state of real happiness and peace, we necessarily must try to evaluate what is the effect that my life and my life choices, how I am living, what is the effect having upon me? And is there anything that I can do to change this? Unfortunately, we've been incredibly dumbed down. The consumer economic system, advertising, so-called social media, all of this requires that we become actually less intelligent and less perceptive, that we become more greedy, we become more envious, we become more avaricious. As was pointed out by Schumacher, there must be an erosion of intelligence, and there must be an utter loss of wisdom, being able to look at life in a very wise way. It's very interesting how in the ancient Vedic culture, they had a completely different take on things. what it was going to take to become happy. The modern formula is that you are constantly shown images, sounds, ideas, things which stimulate your mind and stimulate your desire for something else to fill up that emptiness. All advertising is for this purpose. I can remember years ago the famous slogan that Coca-Cola used to use: Coke is it. Coke is what? Coke is it. There is this recognition amongst advertising executives that every single one of us feels some emptiness, some dissatisfaction within. And what they do is associate products with a promise to remove that emptiness, to remove the unhappiness, to make you fulfilled. And of course, it's a lie. And the problem is that the more we end up consuming, fundamentally, the more unhappy we become. This is a fact. And so in the ancient Vedas, they had a very famous verse that advises us to cultivate this inner strength, to learn, to not feel that I must always respond to the urges which are in my mind. And most of these urges are not coming from me, they've been placed there by others. The more I'm able to live a life of restraint and to tolerate these urges, the greater will be my experience of peace and happiness. So in the one ancient text, there was this verse: a person who is not disturbed by the incessant flow of desires, which enter like rivers into the ocean, which is being filled but is always still. Such a person alone can achieve peace, and not the man who strives to satisfy such desires. That requires some serious contemplation and consideration. But the fundamental lie that greed and envy are in my best interest, that through greed and envy I will become a happier person, a healthier person, the world in which I live will become a better place, is exactly that, a massive lie. You cannot buy happiness. You can buy sensual stimulation, you can agitate your senses, you can consume so many things, but it will not bring you to a state of happiness and fulfillment. But when we buy into this lie, or these lies, then it sets us against one another. It sets us against the world in which we live. It sets us against our very self. So that's about it for now, and we will be continuing the series with some other ideas that I hope you will find both interesting and helpful. Thanks a lot, and see you in the next video we do.